country's top 2 corn producers made huge advances in planting progress over the last week. Farmers in Iowa have now planted 40% of their corn, an increase of 27 points from the previous week. That state is now 11 days ahead of its 5-year average pace. Growers in Illinois are 42% complete, 30 points above a week ago. Here in Nebraska, 16% of the crop is now in the ground, with 1% emerged. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension entomologist Bob Wright to learn why producers can now begin scouting their fields for signs of insect damage.
Several extension educators across the state are putting out pheromone traps for a couple of different types of moths, black cutworm and variegated cutworm. And we're starting to see some black cutworm moths in Nebraska. They don't overwinter in Nebraska, but they fly up in the spring, and it's good to know if they're here so we can be aware that we need to monitor for them as corn emerges.
Yeah, are there numbers indicative of how much trouble you might face later in the year?
No, it's just a general awareness. We can't predict problems in individual fields. You need to go out and scout for individual fields. And the other issue is we have a lot of other types of cutworms in Nebraska other than black cutworms. And the big difference in the life cycle, these other cutworms overwinter as partly grown caterpillars. So they're ready as soon as it warms up and as soon as the corn is emerging, they're ready to start feeding, and the other species can do a lot of damage quickly because they're larger caterpillars than the black cutworm.
What kind of damage should you be looking for?
Okay, the black cutworm, when the eggs hatch out, they initially do some minor leaf feeding on seedlings, and when they get about half grown, they can start feeding at the base of the plant or below ground and actually cut the stem and kill the plant. All the cutworms do that type of feeding. And depending on where the growing point is at the time that they cut the plant, you can either kill the plant or seriously injure it.
How would that damage compare to some of the other insects or pests that might be out there?
Well, some other things to look for. Well, the main issue, I guess, is that cutworms tend to feed at night and hide in the soil during the day. So regardless what problem it is, if there's a stand loss or some sort of injury, it's good to try to dig around the plant or dig up the plant and see if you can find some insects present. See if it's a cutworm, see how big it is. If they're over an inch long, they may have done most of their feeding and it may be too late to treat. Some other options, early season pests that can damage corn include wireworms and white grubs. They can wireworms can bore into the stem and kill the plant. White grubs feed on the roots and can stunt the plant or cause wilting. But you need to know what insect you're dealing with as far as management options.
If it's cutworm damage, do you have any treatment options?
Yes, if you catch it soon enough, that's why we want to monitor things as corn is emerging. Generally, if 4 to 5% of the plants are cut, that's a treatment threshold, and there's a variety of post-emergence insecticides, foliar insecticides you can apply. And I guess the other point is that regardless of what type of corn you have, whether you used a seed treatment or a soil insecticide at planting, if we have high numbers of cutworms, we can still have damage. And so monitor all fields, even if you think you may have done something that would reduce the cutworm problem.
So you said it's also necessary to differentiate if it's coming from cutworms or not, because the treatment would therefore differ?
Right, and the other things we talked about, like wireworms and white grubs, there's no post-plant treatment. They're down in the soil, and the insecticides we have just don't get down there. So at that point, it's a matter of, is there enough stand loss to warrant replanting, and that's the decision for those insects.
For cutworms, how can growing degree days be helpful in trying to determine when to scout?
Well, particularly only with the black cutworm, we have some guidelines based on a certain number of degree days after we have a significant moth capture. That's when we start seeing half-grown caterpillars, which is the size they need to start cutting plants. But again, in Nebraska, we're dealing with multiple species of cutworms, so we can't just focus just on black cutworms. Need to check for several weeks as corn is emerging to watch for what might be damaging it.
Which fields might be most at risk, Bob?
Okay, for the black cutworm, again, the moths fly up each spring and they lay eggs before corn emerges usually, or before corn is planted. And if fields that have winter annual weeds or a lot of corn residue are attractive to the moths to lay their eggs, so those would be fields that would be a risk. And especially if you had a lot of winter annual weeds and you just burned it down shortly after planting, if any of the black cutworms might have hatched and started feeding on those winter annual weeds, they would transfer over to the corn as soon as it emerges, so that would be a high-risk situation in that case.
Bob recently wrote a Crop Watch article about scouting for emerging insects. You can find that through a link on the Market Journal website.